Ruth chapter 1, verse 22, through to the end of chapter 2, which is verse 23. So Ruth chapter 1, the last verse of chapter 1, through to the end of chapter 2. Just while you're finding that, just to say that our Advent theme that we're doing this time, I've called O Little Town. Now, obviously, the town referred to is Bethlehem. It comes from that great Christmas carol that we love so much, O Little Town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. And what we're going to do is, over the next few weeks, is we're going to look at Bethlehem's place in God's redemptive history. And it's very significant, actually. Although it's a relatively small, in fact, a very small town, perhaps even more of a village back then, it didn't have any importance when the tribes were given their towns and villages, etc. Lots of them are mentioned as to which tribe gets which village. It doesn't even get a mention, even though we know it existed. It was so insignificant in those days. And yet it rises to prominence, and we're going to look and to see this important role and what has happened there. So, Ruth chapter 1, verse 22. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you," they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" The foreman replied, "She is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground and exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." And when she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. And as she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, put out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening, and then she threshed the barley as she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave to her what was left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." And then Ruth the Moabitess said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. The book of Ruth is one of those stories that is quite well known. Probably most of us know the story. We've taken out just one chapter of the four. There's only 4 chapters, so if you're not familiar with the story of Ruth, I really encourage you to read through this little book. It really doesn't take too long. The time that it was written was during the period of the Judges. The kings hadn't come to the throne at that time in Israel, so it's the period of the Judges. The times were relatively primitive in those days, and it was a dangerous world that they were living in. But the story of Ruth is a very heartwarming one. It's one that contains words that we find of great comfort. It's a narrative, a story that is quite easy to follow. I mean, it has a beginning, a middle, and end. It's all there, and it's very, very easy to follow it. There's nothing deeply theological, at least not on the surface of it. It's just purely storytelling. And yet it's storytelling with a purpose, because it shows us how the Lord's plan for salvation is worked out in an unlikely situation. Just in case you're unfamiliar with the story of Ruth, or just need a little reminder of it, forgive me if you do know it well, but let me just quickly run through the whole story, because I think it makes more sense, or what I say hopefully will make more sense if we understand the whole story. There was a famine in Israel, and particularly around this lower half of the country. The lower half of the country can be quite desert-like and arid anyway. It's quite dry down there. Bethlehem itself is situated just a few miles south of Jerusalem, and it's just on the edge of the desert anyway. And so it's quite susceptible to drought. And it seems that there was quite a severe famine that was taking place in the country at the time. So a man called Elimelech, along with his wife Naomi, took some action, and with their sons they moved out of the area, and they went across the Jordan to the other side of the Dead Sea. And of course the Dead Sea is so called because it is so hot down there that the water evaporates, just leaving the salt, and so salt deposits all around it. And just to the east of the Dead Sea is the land of Moab. Now it seems that Moab, because it's actually just beyond a range of hills, was not quite as hot as the Dead Sea area, and maybe not quite as hot as Bethlehem and Jerusalem either, but still quite a warm place. But at least they had food. And so they went there, and the plan was to stay there for a while until the famine was over. Whilst they were there, the two sons, they grew up, and it was time to find them wives. And so they took local Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. Sadly, Elimelech died, and Mahlon and Kilian, the husbands of the husbands of the two daughters-in-law, they also died. And so we find that we have Ruth, along with Naomi, and at the start Orpah, all together on their own. And so Naomi says, it's time to go back home to Bethlehem. I can't survive here. She, of course, was a foreigner. She was in a foreign land, and no doubt the people there made life a little difficult for her. This could often be the case where foreigners were concerned. There was no guarantee that a foreigner would be welcomed in the land. And I suspect that Naomi was having a few problems. She had no husband to fend for her. She had no immediate relatives to take care of her. And she decided that she was going back to Bethlehem. And to cut a long story short, Orpah stayed in Moab, but Ruth clung to her mother-in-law and went back to Bethlehem. And that's where, of course, we pick up the story that we've just read. And so Ruth goes out to just pick up some leftover bits of grain in the field, just enough to make a little bit of bread with and to survive. That's all she needed to do at this point. Anything really to get by. But it turns out that she meets up with this man Boaz, who is a distant relative of Elimelech, Naomi's husband. And the customs of the day meant that this man Boaz, or at least one of the close relatives, was responsible for looking after the relatives. And so as Ruth is now married into the family, he takes Ruth as his wife. They get married and live happily ever after. And then a bit further down the line comes David. And so David then is the great-grandson of Boaz and Ruth. And that's really the story. And that's why it's told, because it tells us of the line of David, as well as, of course, a picture of someone being rescued as well. So that's a quick summary of the story. Now, today we're starting this Advent theme, O Little Town, and we want to just focus a little bit on Bethlehem and the place that it has in God's redemptive history. And today I want to look at Bethlehem as a place of refuge. A place of refuge. Now, of course, it was, as I say, the case that there is this terrible famine that's going on. And so a family, and maybe they're not the only ones, there may have been others who also fled the area too and got right out. But it seems the famine is very much over. And there is now abundance once again in and around Bethlehem. Bethlehem, incidentally, means house of bread. And it probably got its name because it was a very productive, fertile area. And as you go to Bethlehem, you'll see there are some lovely hills all around Bethlehem. And later on, of course, we'll look at those hills as being the place where the shepherds were watching their flocks when the angels appeared to them. But at this stage, these fields are being used for growing grain. Now, the chances are that sheep were kept there too, because only just a generation or two later, we know, of course, that Jesse kept a lot of sheep, and his son David was given that responsibility of tending the sheep as the youngest in the family. That was his job, and so it was often given to the youngest to do that. And so we know that sheep farming was also big around that time. Later on, the sheep farming probably became even more intensive, and one of the reasons for that would have been that in Jerusalem the temple was built, and of course there was good reason to have an awful lot of sheep around for the sacrifices. So it would have become a very lucrative business for the local farmers. But sheep farming wasn't the only thing they did, and neither was harvesting of grain. The grain harvest would have taken place in the springtime, probably sort of late spring, maybe sort of May time, possibly April, depending on how warm the weather had been. And the barley would come first, and they would harvest that, and then following on from the barley would come the wheat harvest, and they would then harvest that straight afterwards. So the timing was quite critical on that, but it meant there was a lot of work for a good couple of months for the harvesters. The harvesters were a range of people. They weren't usually all native people just sitting there waiting for the harvest to come round each year. At harvest time, there would have been a lot of people coming from many miles around, travelling in to find work for the harvest. And that's not uncommon today. Even in this country, we have people coming along at certain times of the year, particularly fruit pickers coming from Eastern Europe very often, and they come over here for the season, and they'll pick all the strawberries and raspberries, etc., and then they'll go home at the end of the season. Well, it was a little bit like that in those days, and these strangers essentially would come from miles around looking for work, and they would come and stay there for the duration of the harvest. But of course, it also made it a very dangerous occupation to be gleaning in the fields. And you may wonder, why on earth does there seem to be so much caution around surrounding Ruth's gleaning in the fields? Her mother-in-law is very concerned that Ruth may be harmed if she went to anybody else's field other than Boaz's. She knew that in Boaz's field she would be safe as a relative of theirs. But also Boaz himself, he tells Ruth, he says, you stay with my women and you'll be safe, safety in numbers. But also, again, he warns her, and he tells her that he's warned the harvesters, and he's told the men not to touch her. And again, the reason for this is because these are not local men. These are men who knows what they'd have got up to. They used to drink at night time and get a little bit too much wine inside them, perhaps. And, instinct kicks in. And before you know it, it was not uncommon for women to be molested and even raped. And so he says to her, you just stay there and you will be safe. But it was a dangerous place. There's no doubt about it. It's dangerous because it's a place where she could come to physical harm. It's also dangerous because she has come from her own land. She's left her people. She is now the foreigner. Before it was her mother-in-law that was the foreigner. Now she is the foreigner. There is a long-standing history between Israel and Moab. They were enemies, and they fought one another on a number of occasions. They didn't really like one another. And that happens today, doesn't it? Sort of neighbouring nations sometimes don't always get on too well together. And it's not too uncommon to hear disparaging remarks from the English about the French and the French about the English. It happens. Let's be realistic about it. And it's not just here, is it? It's, other countries too. When they're neighbours, sometimes there's that little bit of friction that goes on between them. And, it's one of those things with Moab and Israel too. There's always been that bit of friction that is there. That actually puts, firstly, it puts Ruth in a very difficult position. And she is amazed when she finds kindness being shown to her because she's a foreigner. She doesn't specifically say she's a Moabitess, but everybody else seems to know that. She refers to herself as a foreigner. They refer to her as the Moabitess. And I guess that in some respects there might have even been perhaps a little bit of disparaging remarks being made there, or a tone in some of the voices that said that. When Boaz turns up and he sees her in the field, he picks her out. He hasn't seen her before. And he sees her and he says, "Who is she?" "She's the Moabitess that came back with Naomi." She's not referred to as, "That's Naomi's daughter-in-law." That's not the first thing in their minds. She's not one of us. She doesn't belong. And that, of course, would make her the perfect target. Very often it is the ugly ducklings of this world that get targeted, that find themselves being victimized. If you don't quite fit into the situation, then you can be fairly sure that trouble is likely to come your way. And that was certainly true for Ruth. But she was in danger because it is possible that no one would have accepted her to work in the fields. She was allowed to go and glean. Now, what is gleaning? Well, what would happen is the harvesters would go along and they would take a sharp metal instrument, hook-shaped, a little bit like a scythe or a fag hook, and they would chop down the tall stalks of barley and wheat. And then after them would come another group of people who would gather them up, and they would tie them up into bundles where they would be standing ready to dry in the sun. But inevitably there was a little bit of the field that, not everything was gathered. Some bits, some stalks were left behind. In fact, it was part of the law that, the edge of the field was left anyway for the poor people to come along. And the gleaners, these were the poorest people, the lowest level of society, were allowed to come into the field and were allowed to gather up those leftover bits. They weren't allowed to take the main harvest, but they were allowed to gather what had been missed. Now, Ruth has sought permission to do this. And again, being the Moabitess that she is, she probably felt it was the right thing to do, to just go and seek permission, say, "May I come in and gather up after your harvesters have been along, whatever they leave over." And she worked very hard, and this impressed everyone. In fact, everyone was talking about her. And I think that this is something else that we learn about Ruth here, is that her act of kindness towards her mother-in-law spoke volumes to the local people. She had given up her security. She had left her family, her homeland, and all the security that brought, and instead had come to a foreign land in order to look after her mother-in-law. And the people were impressed, and they were talking about it. Villages are great places for gossip anyway, at the best of times. Usually it's not of the best kind, but in this case, I think the gossip was justified in terms of the fact that they were picking out somebody and saying, what an amazing lady she is. Look how she has sacrificed so much. She could have abandoned Naomi. She could have said, "I'm staying put in Moab." But she's come back with her with all those associated dangers. But it seems that the action of Naomi, the determination of Ruth. And is it faith? I'm not sure whether there's faith there in terms of thinking they were going to be all right or not. I think that Naomi thought that by going back to where her own people was, that at least there might be someone who might well take her under their wing. Certainly Elimelech had some land and some property, and she wanted to sell that anyway and to raise a bit of money that way. But I think that this integrity that was shown by these ladies has paid off. Because as it turns out that Ruth ends up in this field of Boaz, who's a close relative. It turns out that he is a very kind man. He's a man who's willing to do his duty. In fact, he wasn't the one who should look after Ruth. There was somebody else who was a closer relative, but that relative has his reasons, and they may well have been quite genuine reasons, according to the customs of the day. But he refuses to honour that obligation. But Boaz takes on Ruth, and he marries her. Now, what we see here is that Bethlehem has become, for Ruth and indeed for Naomi too, a place of refuge. In fact, it says those very words really in verse 12, because in the second half of the verse we read these words, "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." You came here to find refuge. You came to find help. You came to find security. You came to find the kindness of the Lord in this place. Clearly in Moab, that was not being extended to Naomi, and she had to go. But here, the situation was different. The people accepted her. The people welcomed her. The people watched over her. The people provided for her. And ultimately, she also became a blessing to those people too. But Bethlehem was the place. I think that Ruth's experience of Bethlehem was such a surprise. I can imagine that, when she contacted home, if she ever did, when she sent that letter, when she got onto Skype or whatever they did, probably not in those days, and spoke to the relatives at home. "Ruth, how are you? Are you safe? Are you well? You certainly look happy. I couldn't be better. This has turned out to be so much greater than ever I thought I would experience. This has turned out to be a wonderful place. The people are so great here. I mean, they're just wonderful people. I'm overwhelmed by the love that has been shown to me in this place." But that's what Bethlehem was. It was a place of refuge. I have to say that Bethlehem was a place that bred some quite rough and ready people. They were not naturally kind-hearted, quiet, peaceful people. There's evidence that suggests that they could have been quite aggressive type of people. Let me give you one or two examples of what I mean. Firstly, just think about the location of Bethlehem. It is a few miles south of the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, even in those days, was a much bigger place than Bethlehem. It may not have been the capital of Israel at the time, but it was significant. The people would have gathered there, and as in all situations where there's a city, you get a mix of people, rich and poor, But basically, it's a little more of a refined kind of place. When you move out into the country, you start to find that people get a bit more rugged. They have to be. They face challenges that you don't get in cities. David would be one of those examples. David is portrayed as being quite a humble sort of guy, yes, but he's quite a warrior too. He knows how to fight. He knows how to defend himself. He knows how to look after his flock even though he was young. He wasn't scared of the lion or the bear. He wasn't afraid of the enemies coming along to steal his sheep. He was prepared to defend them. He wasn't even afraid of the great giant Goliath when everybody else trembled. But what made him into that character? What made him so ready to fight and defend? What gave him that brave heart? I believe in part it's due to the place where he was brought up, the kind of life that he'd led, and the fact that, I say, there seems to be evidence that the people in Bethlehem could be quite, needed to be quite aggressive people. We find at one time the Philistines came along and they captured Bethlehem, and they gave them a hard time there, and the people were, they were aware that they were vulnerable. Unlike Jerusalem, which had the city wall, Bethlehem, if it did have any walls at all, they were not very substantial. So they were always looking out for the enemy coming, who might try to take them. It was a fertile land. They had good crops, so again the enemy would love to come and take that as well. So for these reasons, the people around Bethlehem could be quite strong in their personalities and characters. But Ruth would say that despite that, there was a very kind side to them. They welcomed with open arms. Boaz is a close relative. He's described as a kinsman redeemer. That meant that he was one of those who was so close to Naomi's and her family that he was responsible, at least in part, for looking after his relatives if anything happened to their husbands. In Naomi's case, her husband had died. Her sons are then responsible for looking after her. Both sons have died. She has nobody else. So it then goes back to the kinsman redeemer. And it was the kinsman redeemer's responsibility then to take on looking after his relative's family. And Boaz rises to this challenge. I'm not going to go into great detail about the one who rejected, but Boaz accepted. He was a close relative, and he accepted his responsibility. And as a result, they really did find refuge. They came there as poor, destitute people. But clearly Boaz is a very wealthy man. Boaz is one of these characters who probably lives in a big house somewhere. Maybe he's got lots of servants of his own. He seems to have quite a lot of fields and property. He's a very well-respected person in the community. And he's the kind of person that you would say was a real catch for any woman. Boaz is actually quite touched that Ruth came to him at night at the threshing floor. And he says to her, you didn't go to the younger men. You didn't go and look for those who you thought would be a much better opportunity. But you came to me, and he's really moved by that. But in so doing, Ruth has found that refuge in the kinsman redeemer. It's long been said that Boaz, of course, is a picture for us, up to a point, of Jesus Christ himself, who is our Redeemer. But I want to take that a step further, because I want us to look at Bethlehem as well the house of bread, the place where people receive food, receive all that they need. What is Bethlehem? And I don't want to push analogies too far, particularly when there is very little to base that on, but in a sense, I see a parallel here with the Christian church today. The Christian church is meant to be a place of refuge. When everybody else rejects and turns them away, the Christian church is not supposed to see creed or colour. We're not supposed to differentiate with nationalities. We are one in Christ. We don't distinguish between one person's ability and another person's ability, or one person's social standing and another person's social standing. There is a level playing field that should exist in the Christian church. And I think that as people are around and about in this world, they're finding all sorts of discrimination against them, all sorts of things, and we're reading about it all the time. And as I look and I look at the news and I read newspapers and articles, I'm seeing a world out there that is full of all sorts of dangers, all sorts of terrible things happening to people. Some of them very serious, and some of them just, well, frankly, they just shouldn't be happening, regardless of whether they're serious or not. And then I look at the church and I think, but here is a place that should be like Bethlehem. Here is a place that should be a place of refuge for anyone to come into. And I'm not talking just about our church, I'm talking about the Christian church. That it should be possible for anyone to come through the doors of a Christian church and to find peace and love and joy. Let me just share with you a brief story of something that happened just a few weeks ago, because somebody did indeed come through the doors of the church. And the person who came through was looking for a little bit of help. They were looking for a friendly face, really, someone to talk to share their load and their burden of what they've been going through. And the person had become a Christian. This person was a follower of Jesus, but this person was also a Jew. And so he describes himself not so much as a Christian, but as a Messianic Jew. And you know, the amazing thing is that as the story unfolded, he said that he had been to a synagogue, and they were all very, very welcoming at the synagogue, until they realized that he was a Messianic Jew. And then, in no uncertain terms, he was told that perhaps it would be better if he left. The man then went to a church, and he said, I went into the church, and he said, when they identified me as a Jew, which was not that difficult to do given his headwear, he said, they treated me with great suspicion. And he said, I was not welcomed, and I was told they were too busy to talk to me. So he said, I jumped on the 164 bus, and I headed out here, and because, he'd Googled or whatever, and he'd found us. And he came in expecting to have the same treatment again. And I'm pleased to say that we were able to welcome. And we're able to say, that we are one in Christ. We're able to have fellowship together. And just to share some of the wonders of Scripture. And it's always interesting talking to someone who's been brought up, and him particularly as an Orthodox Jew, to just learn from such a person. And then to see how our New Testament scriptures have their roots so firmly rooted in the Old. But it was a fascinating conversation that I had. And I hope that perhaps one day I might meet up with him again somewhere. But the thing is that the church is meant to be a place that welcomes. It is meant to be a place where the doors are wide open. And yet so very often we have our prejudices that we don't do that. And I want to challenge us to make sure that we don't have the prejudices. It's very easy to just look at somebody when they walk through the doors of the church, even the way they're dressed, and say, oh no, they're not one of us. We never know, do we, what has gone on in somebody's life, in their heart, what's happening to that person. I saw a very moving post on Facebook the other day, and a lady had written on the post. She said, and this was just being forwarded through Facebook. I don't know where it originated, but assuming it's true, but even if it's not, the story itself is very powerful. Because the woman wrote this, she said, I'd just like to say thank you to the anonymous man who gave me 20 pence the other day in the hospital car park when I didn't have enough money. You enabled me to see my father for the last time. And it's sometimes just those little things that seem so insignificant that can mean the most. And I think that that's where we need to be careful not to be judgmental, to be open-minded and open-hearted towards all who come in. There are lots of people out there who are in a very difficult world. We are supposed to be that place of refuge. We're supposed to be that place of refuge because within the church it should be secure. I know that things are not always the way they should be, but that's what we're striving for. That as we follow the law of God, the love of Christ, all his teaching, that it should transform us so that this place becomes a safe haven for anyone. But I think also that it becomes a safe place because it's the place where they meet the Redeemer. It's the place where they can come in and find that not only will they find a welcome and safety in our doors and in our walls, but they find here that they meet the one who can really sort their troubles out. For Ruth, she probably expected to be right there at the lowest level of society for the rest of her life. She probably thought that after that gleaning in the fields for 2 or 3 months was over, what next? Maybe fruit picking or something like that perhaps, but what would she do? How would she survive? I don't know if she'd even thought it all through, but she was prepared to do whatever it took in order to care for her mother-in-law. But actually, as it turns out, that she met the Saviour, the Redeemer, the one who turned her life around, never to look back again. Not only does he take this woman who could have been rejected and accept her, but he puts a ring on her finger, so to speak. He puts clothes on her back. He puts a roof over her head. And he gives her a security which goes on for eternity. Security in those days was seen in childbearing. That they didn't have pensions and things like that to look after, to take care of themselves. They didn't have health services, so they depended on those who would come after them. And as we know that Ruth's family line goes down after Obed, her son, to Jesse, from Jesse to David, and from David, of course, comes the Lord Jesus Christ. There is salvation to be found for all eternity. That's the place we desire to be. We want to be another Bethlehem, a place of bread, a place that provides security and everything that one needs, a place of refuge for those who are in turmoil. It's our job to be those welcomers, and they will find the Saviour. Gillian, please do, yeah.